systems of private power for the future. That's supposed to be an illustration of democracy and markets. And not only is that put forth probably without any attempt at deception, because it's so ingrained that people don't even understand what they're saying, but furthermore, nobody comments on it. I mean, that simply shows how deeply the real principles of the market are embedded, the real principles being fine for the defenseless, but not for the powerful. They need state protection. It's just taken for granted. And this article is a dramatic example of it.
I'd like you to talk about something that's described as equality of opportunity and equality of condition, and then the outcome.
Well, this goes back to Aristotle again. A traditional view, I suspect, a very major view, maybe dominant, in thinking about democratic and free societies since Aristotle, has been that equality of outcome is a major desideratum for a just and free society. If you look at, say, in Aristotle it's explicit. I quoted some of the remarks. If you take, say, Adam Smith, he did advocate markets, had a rather nuanced advocacy of markets, but the argument was based on the assumption that under conditions of perfect liberty, markets would lead to perfect equality, which was the good thing, equality of outcome. If you look at another grand figure of the pantheon, say Alexis de Tocqueville, he had some illusions about American society, but let's put aside the question of whether his descriptions were true, but what he admired was the relative equality that he thought he saw. He somewhat considerably exaggerated it, but that was what he thought was good, that there was equality of outcome, and he pointed out quite explicitly that if you ever get what he called a permanent inequality of conditions, that'll be the death of democracy. Incidentally, he also, in other phrases that are not widely quoted, condemned the harsh manufacturing aristocracy that's growing up under our eyes in the United States. He said probably maybe the most harsh in history, and he said if they get power, then we'll be in deep trouble. And of course it happened far beyond his worst nightmares. But equality, and the same is true of Jefferson and other Enlightenment figures and so on, for completely clear reasons, which has been discussed as far back as Aristotle. So equality of outcome is considered a desideratum. That doesn't mean that maybe not identity of outcome, but at least relative equality of outcome. That's what you're aiming at. Equality of opportunity, which is first of all mostly a joke because it depends on the opportunities depend on the resources available to you and so on. But that's a sharp departure from the tradition of and acceptance of radical inequality of outcome. That's a very sharp departure from the core of the humane liberal tradition as far back as it goes.
One of the mechanisms to address this inequality of opportunity and condition is affirmative action, and that has been under a very severe and sharp attack, and in some states has been eliminated. What do you think of that?
It's kind of interesting. Many societies just take it for granted. So, for example, take, say, India. They have a system, I think it's called reservations, which was instituted at the time of independence, back in the late 40s, in an effort to try to overcome very long-standing and deep-seated caste, gender, and other differences. And any such system is going to impose hardships on some in order to, one hopes, develop a more equitable and just society for the future. How it works is a tricky matter. And has to be done. I don't think there are any simple mechanical rules for it. But the attack on it is, though it's a mixed story, but to a large extent, I think it's an attempt to justify the kinds of discriminatory and oppressive patterns that existed in the past. On the other hand, you can such systems should certainly be designed so that they don't harm other poor people who don't happen to be in the categories that are that are not designated for support. That can be done. In fact, there have been very effective applications of affirmative action in the universities, for example, and many other places in the construction industry and the public service industries and so on. And I think they've been failures, they've been successes, but the main thrust of the program is humane and appropriate. You look in detail, you find plenty of things to criticize.
To talk about public radio and public TV for a moment, I mean, what's been happening is fairly transparent. They're being starved of funding from the public sector and being forced as a result of not having enough money to turn more and more to corporations for what's called underwriting.
That's true, but we, again, have to recognize the premises from which we're starting. Public radio and TV was a very marginal enterprise, never really permitted. There was a battle about this back in the 1920s and 30s, actually. Bob McChesney's done the main work on it. There was a struggle then, radio, as to whether it should be in the public arena or whether it should be handed over to private power. And it was handed over to private power in the name of democracy, which is kind of interesting. It tells you what a strange intellectual culture it is. In the name of democracy, we take the media out of the hands of the public and hand them over to tyrannies. That's democracy. And there's a kind of a contorted logic behind that. When television came along, it wasn't even an issue. Just gave it to them. There was a little fringe that was in the hands of the public. And in fact, as again McChesney points out, that's where most innovation goes on, exactly as in the industrial society. So say FM was public until it started making money, then it becomes private. The internet is a dramatic example today. Public, as long as you can't make money, becomes handed over to megacorporations.